each other? Where is the hope and the empathy? How do we judge off the color? The structure was made to make us the enemy. Praying for change cause the pain makes you tender. All of the names you refuse to remember, but somebody's brother, friend or son to a mother that's crying, saying, I can't breathe. You're taking my life from me. I can't breathe. Will anyone fight for me? Anyone fight for me?
Trying times all the time. Destruction of minds, bodies, and human rights. Stripped of bloodlines, whipped and confined. This is the American pride. It's justifying a genocide, romanticizing the theft and bloodshed that made America the land of the free. To take a black life, land of the free, to bring a gun to a peaceful fight for civil rights. You are desensitized to pulling triggers on innocent lives because that's how we got here in the first place.
All right. Hi, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome to the webinar series being offered as part of the Society of Counseling Psychology as part of Dr. Mary O'Leary Wiley's presidential initiative focused on practice engagement. We are excited that hundreds of practitioners have joined us to learn more about applying the psychology of radical healing to psychological practice. My name is Dr. Batsirai Bunzo-Abaya. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm one of the tri-chairs of the Practice Engagement Presidential Initiative, along with Dr. Christopher Stoltz and Dr. Lisa Ferdinand. A special thank you to Dr. Asmita Pense, who is assisting us with technology today. Please note that you must be present for the entire webinar to get CE credit. I will be sending more information via email about getting CE credit after the webinar. During today's webinar, you can ask questions using the Q&A function in Zoom, and you can share brief comments in the chat during the presentation, as you've already done so far. Following the webinar, I will be sending a PDF version of many of the PowerPoint slides presented today and any additional resources the presenters provide. Today's webinar is also being recorded and will be available in a few days on the Society of Counseling Psychology's YouTube channel. Now, I'd like to briefly introduce our presenters so that we can get started. We have Dr. Brianna French, who is the Associate Professor at the Graduate School of Professional Psychology at the University of St. Thomas. We also have Dr. Gioni Lewis, who's an Associate Professor of Counseling Psychology at the University of Maryland, College Park. And last but not least, we have Dr. Helen Neville, who is a professor of educational psychology and African American studies at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Welcome, Doctors Neville, Lewis, and French. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Batsi. I am thrilled that you invited us and so glad that you all signed up for this webinar. We're going to dive in. We have a lot of content to cover in the hour that we have with you, so we won't hesitate any longer. Thank you. Go for it.
We would like to begin today by recognizing and acknowledging that we are on stolen lands. And I want to acknowledge the Native peoples on the lands, their elders, past and present, as well as their future generations, their poetry, living songs, and their harvest. I'm at the University of Illinois at Urbana, and it resides on the lands of Peoria, Kickapoo, Chickasaw nations, among others. These nations were the traditional territory of these native folks prior to their forced removal. These lands continue to carry the stories of these nations and their struggle for survival and identity. The violence directed toward Indigenous, Native, Aboriginal, First Nations peoples is ongoing. The violence is present when Indigenous peoples' histories are erased, their cultures are trivialized, their resources are seized, their labor is exploited, their children are stolen, and their lives are taken. In order to fight against this violence, occupiers of this land must listen and amplify Indigenous people's voices while fighting against their complicity. I invite you to continue to explore the history of the Native peoples, especially on the lands in which you reside, and their contemporary survivance.
Thank you so much, Helen, for leading us in that land acknowledgement. So just an overview of what we're going to cover today. So I'm going to provide the context and foundations for radical healing. Then Dr. French will provide a psychological framework of radical healing and a case example. And then Dr. Neville will introduce and apply our psychological framework of radical hope and also apply a case example. And then we will kind of wrap it up with some final applications across practice, advocacy, research, and training. And at the conclusion of this presentation, you will be able to summarize the 4 conceptual foundations of radical healing, describe our psychological model of radical healing from racial trauma, and then demonstrate how to apply radical healing in the work with Black, Indigenous, and people of color, both individuals and communities. So we just want to also acknowledge that we are a part of a collective. So the Psychology of Radical Healing Collective began as a group as a part of Dr. Helen Neville's presidential task force in 2018, when she was the president of Division 45, which is the psychological study of culture, ethnicity, and race. And so the task force was created to promote healing through social justice, and it was led by Drs. French and Dr. Della Mosley. And as a part of our work, we really developed this psychological framework of radical healing, which we'll be presenting on today. We also collaborated on several other projects as a way to get our knowledge outside of the ivory tower. So we disseminated our work through a webinar series, Twitter chats. We created an open access radical healing syllabus. And then we also created our Psychology Today blog. And so we're just so fortunate to share this knowledge with you all as a part of our collective. So a tale of 2 pandemics. So of course, we all know that we have been experiencing COVID-19 pandemic for over the last year. And of course, we also had the confluence of white supremacy, which of course we've been experiencing since this country's inception. But last summer, these 2 pandemics came to a head when we learned about several killings of unarmed Black folks and other folks of color which sparked a national outcry and racial uprisings all throughout last summer that really led to a racial reckoning in our country. And so on May 6th of 2020, we learned of the killing of Ahmaud Arbery, who was shot down in the street in broad daylight in suburban Georgia by vigilantes. On May 12th of 2020, we learned of Breonna Taylor being murdered in the middle of the night in her home based on a no-knock warrant. And then on May 25th, 2020, many of us learned and saw the heinous video of George Floyd being killed by the police. And then, of course, all in the aftermath of all of those killings, we see that COVID-19 has had a disproportionate negative effect on BIPOC communities. So for example, the COVID Racial Data Tracker, which is a project with Boston University, has found that nationwide, Black people have died at 1.4 times the rate of white people. And I will say that's the data as of a couple of months ago. And so it might be different even now. We also know that Indigenous communities, Latinx communities, and Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander communities all have higher rates of contracting COVID and dying from COVID compared to white Americans. We also know that there's been unique disparities that intersect with race and gender. So for example, back in December of 2020, there was a report and with the headline, American women have lost more than 5 million jobs in 2020. And so of course, people are pretty alarmed by the fact that all of the jobs lost in that month, the net jobs lost were lost by women. But actually, when you drill down further and looked at the intersections of race and gender, we saw that it was actually Black and Latina women who lost all the jobs, and actually white women had job gains. And Black and Latina women have also been disproportionately affected by the pandemic, working in some of the hardest hit sectors, many as frontline workers, often in roles that lack paid sick leave or the inability to work from home. And then, of course, we also know about the increased anti-Asian hate incidents and harassment. This report that out of all of the Asian Americans who had experienced harassment, 2/3 of them were actually women. And of course, we shined a light on this in March of this year with the heinous killings in Atlanta of several Asian women. And so this is the context where we really think it's important to really think about radical healing and the importance of engaging in radical healing in the context of all of this ongoing racial trauma in our country. And so we want to highlight some foundational theories that really guide our work. So liberation psychology, some important folks to note, Frantz Fanon, Ignacio Martin Baró, Paulo Freire. Liberation psychology articulates the impact of oppression and the importance of striving for justice to liberate from oppression. We also draw on Black psychology, which really names the explicit Eurocentric assumptions in the field of psychology and its detriment to Black communities. It calls on more of an African-centered and culturally centered and strength-based framework for mental health. We also draw on ethnopolitical psychology, which provides a specific liberatory framework for healing from racial trauma. We want to name Lillian Comos Diaz, who created that framework. And then, of course, intersectionality. We draw on the works of Crenshaw, Collins, and many other Black feminist scholars who have articulated the ways in which interlocking systems of oppression produce and sustain inequality. And we also draw on that framework as well. In terms of contemporary roots of our radical healing framework, we draw on the work of Sean Jenright, who wrote the book Black Youth Rising, Activism and Radical Healing in Urban America. He's an education scholar and talks about radical healing in the context of education and working with urban youth. Of course, Dr. Tama Bryant Davis, who has theorized about racial trauma and healing from racial oppression since 2005. And then of course, Lillian Comos Diaz, we want to name, who has really been at the forefront of also talking about how folks of color can heal from racial trauma. So what is radical healing? So radical healing is being or becoming whole in the face of identity-based wounds. It's challenging and changing oppressive conditions. It's recognizing and fostering agency, solidarity, and resistance, and building on the capacity to act on one's environment for individual and collective well-being. And really this idea of radical healing is scaling up the idea of coping or kind of just everyday healing, which tends to operate from a place of more of a person or individual level focus. And we're really trying to scale this up to a multi-systemic level focus. Usually with kind of everyday healing or coping, there's a focus on just the symptoms of the wound in the healing process, whereas radical healing is really trying to consider the root causes of the wound in the healing process. Everyday healing is really about, again, this idea of more individual well-being. We really want to think about both individual and collective well-being with radical healing. And often BIPOC voices might be a part of the story in kind of coping or healing, but radical healing is really trying to center BIPOC voices and experiences and how we resist racial trauma. So next, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. French, who will share a bit more about our radical healing framework.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis. So we'll start by playing the audio and video recordings of two psychologists who shared what radical healing means to them. We'll start with Dr. Sharon Bethia.
It's the process of realizing your power, embracing your power. It's an illumination of your spirit. Radical healing for me is understanding my actions, understanding the beauty of my Blackness. Radical healing for me is understanding who and whose I am. Peace.
Radical healing to me means celebrating my intersectional identities of being gay, Nicaraguan, Egyptian, Chinese, and bringing joy into the world while fighting the good fight.
I love that. So maybe in the chat, you can engage in a little call and response and share what you think radical healing means to you if it's landing with you. I'll briefly review the psychology of radical healing framework. And for us, radical refers to, understanding the critical attitude or ideology that promotes the idea that complete change is necessary to reduce social problems. And as Charlene Carruthers says, it's getting down to and understanding the root cause. So facing a system that does not lend itself to your needs and devising means by which you change that system. So that's what we mean by radical, which is the question I saw pop up in the Q&A. So I'll briefly review each of these components, but essentially radical healing we see as sitting in the dialectic of, at the same time, resisting oppression while also envisioning something different, and that to be in either extreme can lead to potential despair or pessimism or defeat on one hand, or a detachment from reality on the other hand. And so we believe that for healing to take place, both are necessary components to include. So the first assumption, or the first, component of radical healing for us is critical consciousness. And we draw on the original work of Paulo Freire, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, who talked extensively about critical consciousness and the importance of recognizing the role that power plays in people's lived experience. And then Watts, Deemer, and colleagues have further elaborated on critical consciousness and identified 3 necessary components, including critical reflection on your reality, political efficacy to be able to engage that reality, and then action to take steps to change your circumstance. So for us, in the process of radical healing, it leans into an awareness of the impact of systems of oppression and developing or helping develop the confidence and willingness to engage in action. And that action can look varied depending on the person. It can range from being here in the streets of Minneapolis on George Floyd Square to resisting in quiet ways in your own workplace, for example. And we've seen research that shows a positive relationship between critical consciousness and social emotional functioning for BIPOC youth, as well as adults. And there's some literature we set there for that. The second component is cultural authenticity and self-knowledge. Knowing that relying on Western psychology's theories of health can be incomplete at best and potentially oppressive, right, for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And if you haven't yet, I encourage you to read Guthrie's Even the Rat Was White, who outlines the history of racism in psychology. We also work to decolonize therapy. Eduardo Duran wrote about this, amongst others, and return to our ancestral roots, acknowledging that we have cultural wisdom and strengths and healing practices that are worthy of practicing, even if they're not taught in our classes. And finally, self-affirmation, racial pride, the importance of having a sense of identity and connection and belonging. So for radical healing, it incorporates all of these things. And I love this picture of the Aztec dancers who often perform here in the Twin Cities at local protest movements as one example of cultural authenticity. The next component that we see as critical to radical healing is a sense of collectivism, that I am because we are, and that we need each other in this fight. So collectivism connects my own personal liberation with the broader BIPOC communities, and not self-focused, but other-focused and oriented, or in addition to. That you need a sense of belonging and connection to a group or a community in order to have that sense of social support. The process of radical healing then can look like many things. One is to create a counter space for healing, which draws on my colleague here at U of M, University of Minnesota, Tabitha Greer-Reed's work on creating counter spaces in predominantly white institutions for affirmation, belonging, and resistance. And in that vein, authenticity and camaraderie can flourish. We can offer refuge in the context of ongoing racism, a safe haven of some sorts, and testifying with each other. I love this quote from Willa Watson, who many of you may recognize, just reiterating that if you have come to help me, you're wasting your time. I don't need your help, but if you become because your liberation is bound up with mine, then we can work together. So recognizing that none of us are free until we all are free. So the next component is strength and resistance, and that touches on the work of resilience, which is common in our field of psychology, which highlights typically the individual's ability to use available resources and overcome adversities, the bounce back kind of idea, and moves beyond the individual to thinking about communal references for resistance and strength. So it reflects our own commitment to living joy-filled lives despite our awareness of racial trauma and the long lineage of ancestral resistance and power that we have descended from. We would not be here, right, if I was not a survivor of my ancestor who survived some of the most atrocious experiences. And so in the process of radical healing, it's assessing our own resources, individual and community, for strengths and growth and resilience, and working collectively to resist injustices. And this is a powerful picture from the Standing Rock water protectors in northern Minnesota and North Dakota. And then finally, radical hope is the final component of our model, which Dr. Neville will talk about in more detail. But essentially the idea that you have to believe that there's something possible and that you're fighting for something on the other side. Otherwise you might give into a sense of pointlessness. But I'll let Dr. Neville elaborate on that. So I'll wrap up my section with a case example that highlights some of the ways that you might apply radical healing in a clinical context or otherwise. Let's see, so the next slide, okay. So my colleague and I co-facilitated a BIPOC gathering space with who's also a Black man and psychology professional. And we started this group for BIPOC students as a counter space, like I referenced previously, in a predominantly white institution. And so it was sponsored through our counseling center as well as the diversity office. And we were intentional about not calling it a therapy group to try to reduce some of the stigma that's associated with therapy in BIPOC communities and treat it more as an open-ended group. So we weren't rigid about attendance or, you know, other criteria for participating, so that people felt like they could drop in when they wanted to. And so at the outset, this taps into that collectivism and social support realm of our radical healing model by encouraging that group environment and peer support. So I'll refer to a fictional example. This is not an actual person, but just a common experience that many of the people in my community have faced this past year. So a Black woman college student, undergraduate, is experiencing a lot of grief and loss, and her grades are impacted. Her family members have gotten sick with COVID. She is experiencing ongoing racial violence. We in the Twin Cities here relived George Floyd's murder a few months ago through the trial of Derek Chauvin. And then not long before that trial was finished, we learned of a murder of another Black man killed by police, and right in the suburbs of the same city. And so this is impacting a lot of the Black students in our campus and staff and teachers and so on. So all while navigating college, she then struggles to acknowledge the toll that this has taken on her and feels guilty for her falling grades. She believes other people have had it much worse than she does, and who is she to complain? We see then a difficulty concentrating, low motivation, increased sleep, and a lack of interest in anything in particular. So she joined this BIPOC healing space, and in this group, what we try to do is try to integrate cultural authenticity at the outset by using rituals. So at the beginning of every session, we pour libations, which is a West African tradition that pours water into a plant for nourishing the earth and honors the ancestors who have come before us. We say the names of people who we want to remember. We share our intentions for the present, what we hope to get out of the group today, and then our hopes for generations yet to come and how we want to leave the world for that generation. We've had oftentimes students come just for the libations as a way to ground in cultural practices, and had class or had work or whatever and could only come for that first 10 minutes, but found just that in and of itself was a grounding, healing experience. So in our group, we then share testimony and receive a validation and naming racial and gender trauma that for example, in this young woman's case is experiencing. You hear from other people, discuss their challenge and validate their experiences, and then it normalizes the difficulty of maintaining a sense of productivity in the face of racial strife. So sharing and testimony in that heart space is a piece of that. We invite reflection on times then that they have seen someone persevere or beaten the odds as a way to connect to that sense of strength and resistance, and knowing that there are people here and in the past who have resisted and succeeded. We also encourage visiting sacred sites like George Floyd Square and other community healing spaces, and include discussions, for example, on public safety without policing as a way to imagine possibilities and be grounded in a sense of cultural authenticity. So we also then find ways to laugh, bring in music like we just did today, be loud, quiet, swear, sing, all as a means to try to offer an authentic counter space to white supremacist environments. And we've also finally engaged in advocacy as co-facilitators as a way to address some of the institutional barriers and addressing some of that root kind of issue in some ways. Changing policing is one of them, and then supporting academic success is another. So we encourage faculty in our institution, for example, to offer extensions, modify requirements, offer incompletes where necessary, especially for BIPOC students who, in the Twin Cities especially, are experiencing a lot of multiple stressors and trauma. And then I'll just highlight this photograph is of Janelle Austin, who took a lot of time and care to preserve the art in George Floyd Square. And I just love that this represents a sense of like being at the site where he was murdered that has now been shifted into a sacred healing space of community activism and repurposing it for something better. So I'll turn it over to Helen.
Thank you, Dr. French. We're gonna just hone in a little deeper into this concept of hope. And I wanna first talk a little bit about the traditional ways in which hope has been viewed in the psychology and health literature. Traditionally, if we were thinking about Charles Snyder's notion of hope, we're thinking about goals, identifying the future goals and the pathways for achieving those goals. But the goals that he talks about and psychology talks about are goals that focus on the individual and individual achievement. I think some of the hope in the nursing and medical field taps more in terms of the things that we are interested in. Hope is an anticipation of a future which is good based on mutuality, and it brings in the ideas about relationships with others, a sense of personal competence and coping ability, psychological well-being, purpose and meaning of life in a sense of the possible. And so later on, when we unpack our notion of hope, you'll notice that we are going to incorporate these sensibilities, particularly meaning and purpose and what is possible. Returning to Sean Ginwright, I just love this quote of him. And I think this quote captures radical hope so well, and the ways in which we are trying to estimate it. The healing process fosters hope, which is an important prerequisite for meaningful civic engagement and social change. Together, healing and hope inspire youth to understand that community conditions are not permanent, and that the first step in making change is to imagine new possibilities. And I think what is really key here is to understand that things are not permanent. Sometimes it's easy when we witness things like the murder of George Floyd to fall into a pattern of like, nothing will change, this will always happen. And this notion of hope allows us to counter these messages. So what does radical hope mean to you? Again, if folks want to talk about radical hope, if you want to drop those in the chat, we'd love to hear what you think about radical hope. But let's listen to what Parker has to say.
To me, radical hope means embracing that there is power in history, power in my lineage, power in deconstructing colonial ideas that have harmed us, reminding myself that I come from a lineage of resilient and powerful people, and that I can create change in the world.
Wow, I just love this. I love how you young folks can really bring things to life. of talking about the resilience, talking about the lineage in which a person comes from, and one's responsibility to create change. And I also like this image of something that Dr. Hector Adames does in his work of Radical Hope Rising, in which he has the students in his clinical seminar class kind of outline some of the ways in which they're going to use their psychological science and cultural knowledge to address psychological and problems and improve people's lives. So working together in our collaborative and our collective, we really wanted to think through and unpack what radical hope was. And we developed this emerging theory of radical hope. And radical hope involves the steadfast belief in the collective capacity contained within communities of color to heal and transform oppressive forces into better future despite the overwhelming odds. And that is so important. That notion of despite the overwhelming odds, to that belief that we can make some changes, really captures this idea about faith and agency, that our work will make some transformation. And when we think about faith and agency, we're not just talking about a religious or spiritual faith. It also incorporates a sense of a political faith and agency. So that's particularly important. So here what you have is this figure, and this helps us understand what it is that we mean and the complexities of radical hope. So we're moving away from thinking about us as individuals and our individual future to thinking about us as individuals in community with others and our collective future, particularly in very trying times, such as the past year. Our kind of model and thinking about radical hope takes into consideration not only the future, but the past and the present. And the past and the present informs our future behavior. Kind of like the Sankofa bird that looks back. In order to move forward, we need to look back to see where we've come from. It also is taking into consideration these levels of individual focus and an orientation and a level of an orientation of collective. And there's lots of things I want to talk about. These areas in these 4 quadrants are pathways. So the hope literature, particularly the psychology of hope literature, focuses on pathways to achieving hope. And we've identified kind of 4 pathways here that I'd like to spend a little bit more time articulating those pathways, and then also then providing an example, which hopefully brings those pathways to life. When we think about history and oppression, the process of understanding the history of oppression and resistance of people of color is a pathway to radical hope. The role of history is to identify the ways in which the present has been shaped by the individual and collective actions of previous generations in order to inspire possibilities of what could be possible. And so in order for people of color to envision possibilities of a better, more egalitarian tomorrow, it is important to understand the intersecting forms of oppression that different racial and ethnic groups face, like dispossession of land, broken treaties, genocide, enslavement, racial labor exploitation, voter suppression, criminalization of immigrants, gender exploitation of people of color, and we can go on and on. And it's important to realize that we are more than just notions of oppression. We are more than just that, that we have resisted that and created new opportunities for ourselves. So it's important to tap into what those, how our resistances help transform realities and actually worked to create a society that is more egalitarian. The idea of ancestral pride is important, and we propose that embracing ancestral pride serves as a pathway to radical hope. This is our sense in believing and having a strong racial and ethnic identity, a strong sense of pride in the accomplishments of our foreparents and what they've endured and accomplished. And there's actually some research that helps supports this as well. Jaeger and Iloraga and their colleagues asked Latinx high school students to either write about what makes them proud to be part of the Latinx community or what makes them proud to be a member of their senior class before kind of completing this questionnaire. And what they found was that youth in the ethnic pride condition reported higher levels of state hope, particularly this notion of agency or motivation to pursue their goals in the present time. So we've got some research to kind of support what we're thinking in terms of our heuristic. Envisioning possibilities. So this is in the very core understanding of both individual and collective hope. I particularly love this image by Joshua Mays because it calls up the idea of Afrofuturism, which is reimagining a future which is filled with art, science, and tech through a particular Black lens. It gets at the idea of possible futures and alternative realities. And so that's important, that we cannot just limit ourselves to what is grounded in now and what is real, but we must rethink what is even the unimaginable. We must dream some as a way of propelling us to move forward. And then also all of the definitions of hope bring into this idea of meaning and purpose, the importance of having that be a core of how we see ourselves. And so this quote here is from one of the interviews that we have conducted with psychologists, mental health workers, and people outside of the field about what does radical hope mean to them. And in this quote, Malik just talks about how things change over time, how movements change over time, but finding these nuances and cracks in the movement identifies ways that you can actually make change. And then later on, he talks about that being part of his life mission to be able to find the ways and the rooms in which he can make change. I'd like to spend a moment just talking a little bit about a radical hope case example. And one of the things I wanted to do was to build on the example that Dr. Brianna French provided. And so when we think about the horrible, horrible murder of George Floyd and how difficult that was for everyone, it was also an opportunity for us to show up and provide a gift to our students and the professionals that we work with. So my example will be more in terms of what faculty might be able to do, what administrators, department chairs, and or college deans might do. This is things that I think are best practices, things that I tried to implement it, but didn't quite implement it as well, things that I saw other people implement that seemed to be hitting the mark a little closer. So the first thing here is this idea of really naming the injustice and harm. I know it was incredibly painful when there were departments or units who ignored the fact that this horrific thing happened during a global health pandemic. And it was incredibly painful for students. And so the flip of that is to name that an injustice has happened, that a life is lost, to mourn with the community, and to connect that that harm and loss of life with something broader, to connect it to a sense of systemic racism and white supremacy. And then the next is this idea of how do you create space? And right now, thinking particularly about creating space for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And there's a couple ways in which you can do that. You can create a BIPOC space to process this, or you can create affinity spaces in which people process it among their own racial and ethnic groups that they identify with. And in this space, it really provides people an opportunity to really mourn, to talk about the pain in which they're experiencing, to provide people opportunities to share stories in their own lives that might mirror those, but to sit with, support, and bear witness to what it is that we are experiencing and our communities are experiencing, and how it is connected to generational forms of trauma. I think that is really, so just creating space and an opportunity to do that. But creating space is not enough. There is importance of doing things other than that. And so we also encourage reflection. And so thinking about these pathways to radical hope, one reflection could be in terms of thinking about the history of oppression and resistance. So not only thinking about when has this happened before, but to understand that while this moment is incredibly painful, we know that our ancestors have gone through a lot worse and have resisted, and hear what their resistance have resulted in terms of changes now. Also kind of reflecting on this history of oppression and resistance also allows us to look at perhaps mistakes they might have made, but also allows us to dream, where do we want to take our new levels of resistance? What is even possible? And even thinking about what is happening now, the reflection should be in the past when we think about killing of unarmed people through white supremacy. We think about, say, Black folks resisting and a few other people joining the fight. And when we think about what happened with George Floyd, that was really a flashpoint for a solidarity forms of resistance across racial and ethnic lines and across national boundaries. We saw folks in Hong Kong and Mexico and Palestine and South Africa and England showing notions of solidarity and speaking out against anti-Blackness. That can give a sense of hope by saying where we've been in the past, where we are now, and where we might go, what it might even look like in the future. Resistance can also, reflecting can also be, let's reflect on the struggles of our ancestors and our current living, and how people that are living, our parents and grandparents, and listening to their stories, and really using that as fuel for us to move forward. The other piece is another pathway to this radical hope is also the idea of nurturing dreaming. In the interviews that we've been doing, one or more of our participants have talked about this idea of thinking about envisioning possibilities as radical dreaming. And so to really sit with students and to provide them an opportunity to say, what world would you like to live in? What changes would you like to see made? And give them the space to kind of do that as well, for them to kind of counter the fact is nothing can happen from this. So really provide this opportunities and space for radical dreaming. The notion is it doesn't have to be at the same time that people are sitting with the pain that they're in. It can be in terms of a future time. And the other piece of this is this fostering commitment. By exploring and reflecting on the histories of oppression and what our ancestors have done and poured into us, hopefully that will instill us a sense of responsibility for us to improve our current conditions for ourselves now, as well as future generations. So to really kind of have that, this could be part of who we are as people and part of our professional identity. And I think in the discussion that Dr. French had, she did a beautiful job of talking about the ways in which faculty can model advocacy in which we are moving toward that. Folks that have some level of power are moving toward the idea of a more egalitarian future.
Okay, thank you, Drs. French and Dr. Neville, for those great case examples. So just to kind of summarize a few applications, as you all have been, already hearing about some of these clinical applications and applications to practice. So again, this idea of testimony being really important for our work with clients and patients and students, community-based healing, and expanding this idea of what healing looks like, and the importance of collaborating with respected Indigenous elders, spiritual leaders to provide these alternative healing spaces, or even as Dr. French shared, having this other type of healing space and not having it be viewed or framed as therapy can be another way to kind of engage in a radical healing practice. And then radical healing ethics, so seeking to assess power dynamics and recognizing the bidirectional benefits of the relationship, and really this idea of bearing witness. In terms of research, particularly clinical research, I think it's important to shift away, again, from this Western individualistic person level notion of healing. We want you all to think about kind of developing this multi-systemic focus in terms of healing, centering on the strengths and voices of BIPOC folks, centering on the most marginalized, using other types of methodologies in our work, right? Drawing on participatory action research and other epistemologies and ways of knowing, and really also, of course, having this grounded within this structural context. I also, want to mention that even with clinical research, there are ways that we can really think differently about our traditional psychotherapy process and outcome research. How can we actually do more research on radical healing and therapy and what that looks like, and how the effectiveness of that? And then also thinking about radical healing and applying it to education and training, we really want to encourage folks to push beyond this idea of just multiculturalism and really embrace social justice, liberation psychology, intersectionality, radical healing, really trying to put this more at the center of our curricula. People have been talking a lot about decolonization and decolonizing the work in our field that has been created from kind of a white centered, Eurocentric perspective, really also valuing critical consciousness development and having that be a essential piece of the training that we do. Also with training programs, again, centering on BIPOC students and students who are multiply marginalized, thinking about ways that we can infuse social justice more in our training models so that students are learning about how to engage in social justice advocacy, and really just in terms of advocacy in general, really encouraging ways that we can use our research for public policy or use our research to support activism and political resistance to oppression. And those are important components of applying radical healing to our advocacy as well. And next, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. French to close us out, and hopefully we have time for Q&A.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis, Dr. Neville. So we did pretty good on time. We wanted to wrap up to give some time for Q&A. So just to summarize what we discussed, the psychology of radical healing model, in it we try to incorporate the rich tradition of what we already know and the work that BIPOC scholars have done, and combine that into a framework for understanding a model of healing from racial trauma by and for folks of color. It's designed to center the folks of color in our strengths in our own communities. So we're relying on what we know works for us. It calls for a paradigm shift, as Dr. Lewis mentioned, demands inclusion of action to improve the health and well-being from a multi-systemic approach. And so moving upstream to the factors that lead to distress and despair in the first place, in addition to symptom reduction. And then of course, the training implications for how we prepare the workforce for the future. So I hope that this was helpful and that you got something out of it. And now we will turn to Q&A.
So I just want to express deep gratitude for Doctors Neville, French, and Lewis. Thank you so much for this rich information. I feel like I need to watch the recording again, just to really soak in everything you said. So thank you so much. There have already been some questions answered in the Q&A, and of course, please feel free to expand on some of those questions. One question that was asked earlier, and I think you responded in the chat, but I just wanted to read it out again because the participant had some additional thoughts about that. So the question was, how does revolutionary love come into this framework, if at all? So if you could just speak a little bit more to that. I think you already answered that in the Q&A as well.
Yeah, so that was in reference to Valerie Carr's work that we cited, I think, if I'm remembering the question that I saw pop up. And so I have not yet read that text specifically, but I do want to go back to that particular slide. And so that was when we were thinking of radical hope and envisioning possibilities. And Valerie Carr is a Sikh activist who gave this really powerful, among many things, one of the things that drew me to include her in this presentation, but I rushed through it thinking we didn't have time, is a speech that she gave right after Donald Trump was elected in 2016. A Sikh prayer for America. And I'll just give a brief quote. In it, she says, "In our tears and agony, we hold our children close and confront the truth. The future is dark. But my faith dares me to ask, what if this darkness is not the darkness of the tomb, but the darkness of the womb? What if our America is not dead, but a country still waiting to be born? What if the story of America is one long labor? What if all the mothers who came before us, who survived genocide and occupation, slavery and Jim Crow, racism and xenophobia, Islamophobia, political oppression, and sexual assault, are standing behind us now, whispering in our ear, 'You are brave'? What if this is our great contraction before we birth a new future? Remember the wisdom of the midwife. Breathe," she says, "then push." And so I love that image of thinking about darkness and what's on the other side. Is it death and despair, or is it possibility and light? And how do we use our own agency to decide? So I'm not sure if revolutionary love speaks to that as much. Again, I have not yet read that, but love her work and could absolutely see it applying just from what I do know.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think a few people would like the citation in the chat. So if you have that accessible, please share that. Another question that came through was, can you comment on your own evolution to this approach?
Helen, do you want to take that one to maybe talk a little bit about your initiative as president of 45 a few years ago? And you were our leader as we kind of gravitated towards this particular moment.
Sure, I will. I'll do a. Yeah, I would love to. So I remember a while ago, I had the opportunity to live in Tanzania for an academic year. And while I was in Tanzania, it was so fabulous. I was thinking, like, why do I feel so great? Why, what's going on? And what I realized is that I didn't have to deal with racial oppression. I didn't have to deal with the same in-your-face notions of white supremacy. And it was incredibly liberating where, I'm not questioned on a day-to-day basis. I felt physically better. And so during that time, I had the opportunity and it was invited to put my hat into the ring to think about being president of APA Division 45, and really was thinking about the toll that racial oppression and how it intersects with other kinds of identities, what toll that plays on us physically, psychologically, and how freeing it is when we can embrace cultural ways of being. And so really wanting to make sure that it was BIPOC folks thinking among BIPOC folks, what is it that we need to do? Not the notion of healing across racial lines with white folks. That's one way. There's nothing wrong with that, but just for us to have a conversation. And so that's one thing. And then thinking through this, I had an opportunity to do these racial life narrative interviews with people in a variety, Black folks in a variety of different countries, and them talking about this healing process and what that meant. So for me, it moved to like these ideas of it, its connection to racial identity, but connecting it to structural ways in which this radical healing can take place. Particularly, are we talking about reparations? Are we talking about reconciliation? Are we talking, so like understanding the structural ideas about justice, and then learning more from the collective and the thinking through that and emerging, like what does that look like on our individual psychological healing, and how do we place that in conversation with people who've already done the work? So anytime I realize that if I have an idea that I think is original, it's like, forget it, because other people have already done the work. And it's been wonderful to think with and learn from the Radical Healing Collaborative, who've done such great work and the insights. So that's a little bit about my own kind of processing.
Drs. Lewis and French, would you like to add anything before we go to the next question? Okay. So, oh, please go.
Okay, I don't need to add much. I guess I'll just say that in addition to the what drew me to it, it's also the experience of the collective that is giving me life. And so, you know, our text threads and encouragements and supports and WTFs, just having a community to rely on has been life affirming in this academic space, especially. So I'll just add that. Thank you, Helen, for bringing us together.
I just so love what you say in terms of what you said, Bree, is having the opportunity to create this counter space in which we can live out radical healing.
Right.
And that's what kind of what the collaborative has been able to do collectively. I love that, Bree, and that is so true.
Yeah, that was actually the only other thing I was going to say and add is I felt like we had this parallel process as we were kind of working through developing the model and, you know, doing a lot. And we spent a lot of time doing a lot of reading about a lot of these kind of foundational theories, because again, as Helen said, we knew we weren't creating something completely new. We really wanted to honor and draw on and cite, right, many of these BIPOC scholars and activists and others who have been doing this research for far longer and this work for far longer. And then throughout the process of our work, we really had this parallel process around radical healing, which it's like, that's something we could write about at some point, but you know, just the ways in which we have created this counter space has been really, really amazing. So, but yes, you can, thanks, Watsy.
All right, so I'm going to combine two questions here that are kind of related. So the first is, I have a question about measurement and methodology. Much of this work doesn't seem to get the same limelight / focus because measurement and demonstration of impact is hard to demonstrate. And the second question that is somewhat related to that one is, many well-meaning white psychologists or researchers are not willing to take on this type of research. Should we encourage them to get involved, or is this type of work more relevant for BIPOC researchers and psychologists?
So I can take a stab at it, and then I'm sure others might want to chime in. I mean, I think one thing that we as a collective have been talking about as of late, I mean, we love that so many people are really gravitating towards radical healing and this concept of radical healing and trying to understand it and trying to do research on it. I think that we also know that, you know, we created this to center BIPOC voices, as we've talked about. And so we think that's another important piece to doing the work, right? Is not, again, continuing to, particularly as white scholars, not doing the work on us and on BIPOC, actually collaborating and working alongside BIPOC scholars to continue to do this work or any of the work and research on these topics is really essential. So it doesn't feel like extracting information from BIPOC communities, but it's actually partnering and working alongside BIPOC communities. As it relates to the other piece around measurement, I mean, I think that, you know, yeah, there are different methodologies and ways that we can, you know, work and use, and we, you know, kind of critique some of the post-positivist methodologies, but, you know, we're also doing some of this qualitative work on radical healing, may end up deciding to create a radical healing measure and really using mixed methodology as a way to, you know, get and understand a lot of these questions and phenomenon from different positionalities and perspectives and different epistemologies, and seeing the benefit of actually combining methods to do this work is also really important. So I don't know if anyone else has anything to chime in with that. But.
All right, sorry, we have a lot of questions. I don't think we're going to get to all of them. One question was, any sense of whether a radical healing model would increase or decrease the chances of therapeutic burnout among therapists and trainees?
Well, that's a good question. I think as I think about that, I'm inclined to assume it would decrease burnout because we aren't, you know, I don't know if this was super clear, but we're advocating for multiple methods of healing. And I think that was, as Dr. Neville mentioned, part of her vision was like radical healing through social justice or through ways that activism in and of itself can be healing. And so it doesn't have to be solely on the clinician or one provider to be that, but that we're encouraging the community all hands on deck kind of approach. So I would hope that it would reduce burnout from that perspective, and be more bi-directional. In our paper, we write about a radical healing ethic, and that the clinician is getting as much from the process as the client, and being gifted with their testimony and affirmation. So that's my inclination, but that's a good question.
Yeah, and if I could just, I love what Bree just said, and one of the things that I really like is it's like parallel processes. I feel as though that people of color will get a lot from engaging in concepts of radical healing, because it could also incorporate notions of radical self-care and etc. So engaging in radical a radical healing as a therapeutic intervention is separate than one individually client that therapists can engage in radical healing for themselves. And I think that could be incredibly powerful.
So thank you all again so much. One quick question before we wrap up. How do people get involved? So that was one of the questions. If they want to be part of this, what divisions in APA, or do you have any suggestions for how people can join?
Uh-oh, crickets. Let's see. I guess I was thinking of the Radical Healing Collective itself, and that's kind of a small group, but I think there are certainly other avenues that come to mind. For example, Academics for Black Survival and Wellness is starting Saturday on Juneteenth. So if you haven't yet, I encourage you to register for that. That is a powerfully healing radical space in and of itself. I would say the EMPAs, Ethnic Minority Psych Associations, would be another place for resisting and engagement. Division 17, of course, and Division 45, Division 35, and Division 44 come to mind. But I'd also say like just community, like engaging in your own community activism feels maybe even more radical than the existing organizations. There are ways that a lot of activists across the country are trying to create something different that's really inspiring and empowering. Just small anecdote, they're trying to open traffic up here for George Floyd Square in Minneapolis. Since he was murdered, it's been blocked off with art and really just kind of a sacred place. But anyhow, the city wants to open up the traffic, and there's differences of opinion in the residents of that neighborhood. So it's not an easy process. Some people want it open, some people don't. Some folks have then said, "Oh hell no," and talk about resistance. As they took down the barricades, they then brought in some old busted washers and dryers to make their own barricades up around the space. Oh no, we are keeping our sacred land here. Thank you very much. So anyhow, small anecdote of ways that people can kind of engage in their own community healing.
Thank you all again so much for this amazing work that you're doing and all of the wisdom that you have shared with us. It is really inspiring to hear about your work. So to everyone else, again, thank you so much for joining us. We are going to email you information about CEs as well as details about this presentation. And you're getting a lot of appreciation in the chat. So I hope the three of you are able to just glance at some of the thank yous you're getting there.
Bonzi, can I say one thing? So I know people are asking for resources. So in the chat, I post our 2 article citations, and then one of our collective members, H.E.R, just posted our radical healing syllabus. And we can get those to Botsi so that those will be emailed a follow-up as well for folks with the CEs. But yes, so we have an open access syllabus that has, basically we created like a 15-week, if you were really teaching about radical healing in a 15-week semester. So we have lots of citations and resources and reference and multimedia and other things for folks to reference. We also have a Psychology Today blog, the Psychology of Radical Healing Collective, and you can be on the lookout for content that we will post there as well.
I'm just pausing to see if Dr. Neville wants to say anything before we wrap up, and if not, no worries.
This was fun. Thanks for the invitation. And I think Bree's gonna play some music as we head out.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you all.
You should have been downtown. The people are rising. We thought it was a lockdown. They opened the fire. Them bullets was flying. Who said it was a lockdown? Goddamn lie. Oh my, time heals all, but you out of time now. Judge gotta watch us from the clock tower. Little tear gas cleared the whole place out. I'll be back with the hazmat for the next round. We was trying to protest and the fires broke out. Look out for the secret agents, they be planted in the crowd. Said it's civil